were passed, collectively called deregulation. All the old regulations that had kept us safe were stripped away. Now, I've only got time for really 3 of these. In 1999, we had the Financial Services Modernization Act, also called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. This repealed the 1933 Banking Act. The 1933 Banking Act was also called the Glass-Steagall Act, and this completely separated the commercial banks from the investment banks. The B of A's, the Wells Fargos, the high street banks from the Wall Street banks. You couldn't borrow to speculate in stock. You couldn't borrow to speculate in these mortgages and these CDOs. Gramm-Leach-Bliley put those 2 banks back in bed together again in the face of all warnings that it was reckless. Next, there was the Act in 2000, the Commodity Futures Deregulation Act. This totally exempted derivatives, CDOs, CDSs, from all oversight. It allowed banks to hold derivatives as part of their Tier 1 capital. It gave Wall Street a license to steal. It gave Enron a license to steal. You know how that worked out, don't you? Not only was Wall Street given a license to steal, ladies and gentlemen, it was given a pat on the back, I tell you. In 2004, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which regulated Wall Street, almost stripped away the requirements that Wall Street have capital, cash, gold bars, etc., as working capital in the vault. They could get down to 2.5% of capital relative to assets. Now, don't worry about what that means. Take my word that it's minuscule. It's about 1/3 of what normal banks have to have.
In other words, if they had IOUs to say 1 million, if they owed $1 million in IOUs, they only actually had to have 2% of that $1 million on hand.
2.5%.
Right. So if everything went downhill from there and they couldn't pay back the $1 million, they had nothing to pay it back with.
Hardly any cushion.
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. All federal oversight, in short, was gone. Okay, there was a bit of state oversight, though. The Attorney General, the Elliott Spitzers, these tried to rein in the abusive lending practices, but were restrained by court orders from the OCC, the Office of the Controller of the Currency. This is a federal thing reporting to the White House. The Elliott Spitzers of this world were stopped from reining in the abusive lending. There's a moral to this story. Don't handcuff the police. Next, the rating agencies. Now, you don't hear much about rating agencies, but these are the people who gave these AAA ratings. Now, a lot of money is raised on the bond market, and these rating agencies rate the credit, you see. They specialize in credit. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example. Supposing you go and buy a used car. Okay, you might want your mechanic to look at it, and he'll check it out, test the systems. Yes, engine works fine, and he will give you the equivalent of a AAA rating. So, what might happen though if you go to buy a used car, and the seller says, "Oh, here's a AAA rating from my mechanic." Might you not say, "Pull the other one, it's got bells on"? Let's look closely at this system. These AAA ratings were not paid for by the suckers buying these tranche CDOs. They were paid for by Wall Street. Do you think Wall Street might have exerted a little bit of undue influence on the AAA people? Do you think of uncooperative AAA people? So this isn't AAA, nah, it's triple B. Yeah, next one please. They played rate shopping. Now, in all fairness, it must be said that these AAA people the Standard & Poor's, the Moody's, the Fitch, and others realized that they were in a massive conflict of interest. So they gave the tiniest little CYA on these ratings. I've read them, but they were buried in the reams of legalese and boilerplate. So there is a moral to this story. Do not give sticks of dynamite to children to play with, even if there is a tiny little warning label. Clearly, Wall Street bears a lot of blame here. It totally ignored all the Cassandras, totally ignored all the conflict of interest, focused solely on short-term profit, and it said, trust us. And do you know something? People did. There's another moral here. Don't let somebody run a nuclear power plant and pay them a bonus to take shortcuts. Blows up. And it did blow up. Doesn't stop at Wall Street. Do you remember Wall Street was getting these mortgages from the mortgage companies? The mortgage companies put a lot of pressure on the appraisers to pump up prices. They put a lot of pressure on the brokers to crank out the mortgages. I once went to some banker's drinky-do thing, you know, some mixer, you know, chatting to one guy, and he casually mentioned, as if it was the most commonplace thing in the world, he was a mortgage broker, he casually mentioned that he had made $200,000 last month. I just about passed out cold. I've never made that in a year. Do you think these mortgage brokers were involved in deceptive practices, sucking in these homeowners? Do you think they were signing them up for high profitable subprime loans when they could have had a standard loan? Of course they were doing it. The whole thing became a joke. These loans that they were cranking out were called ninja loans. No income, no job, no assets. The old days when you had to beg for a mortgage were gone. As long as you could fog a mirror, you got your mortgage. The Times of London is not a liberal publication. It's owned by Rupert Murdoch. But it called this whole system an elaborate game of pass the parcel because the risk was shuffled down to the suckers at the end who trusted that there was integrity in the system, and I tell you there was none. The Economist magazine, again not exactly a liberal journal, said that the mortgage system of America was rotten to the core. This company AIG that we've touched on, American Insurance General, was at one point by far the biggest mortgage company in the world. It issued by far the greatest number of these credit default swaps, these bells and whistles I told you about, these insurance policies. Now, how do you think it went about that? Do you think it went about that with the policy of most integrity or least integrity? Well, least integrity, of course. It got to choose its own regulator. By buying a little thrift, it could be regulated by the OTS, the Office of Thrift Supervision, which frankly, I can tell you as a banker, is a bit of a joke. It put its CDS unit in London. So how many flights do you think the OTS people took to London to check out what was going on there? In round numbers, none.
Isn't it true, Ray, that the entire OTS has only one insurance regulator in the entire OTS for AIG,
yes.
the largest insurance company in the world?
That's why they chose it.
One regulator.
That's why they chose it.
Yeah.
But this is called getting government off people's backs, you see, David.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there were other things that contributed, David, to answer your question. There was short selling of stocks. A rule, a vital rule called the uptick rule, was taken away in around 2003. I'm not going to explain it. All you need to know is that this regulation was junked. This then gave rise